When you think of the Olympics, recent host cities like London, Rio, and Beijing come to mind, with big elaborate opening ceremonies, thousands of athletes, millions of people attending, and all with a multi-billion global audience. But things weren't always this way. As on August the 30th, 1904, in St. Louis, Missouri, the Olympic marathon began under blistering heat, and what should have been a test of human endurance over a 40-kilometre course instead soon became one of the most chaotic, dangerous, and outright absurd races in Olympic history. It was a contest known for its heat stroke, hallucinations, cheating, and of course, rat poison, because as we all know, no Olympic marathon would ever be complete without it. The story of the 1904 Olympic marathon is not a tale of athletic triumph, but of survival, scandal, and sheer ridiculousness. The modern Olympic Games were still in their infancy in 1904. The first modern Olympics had been held in Athens in 1896, but by the time the third Games came around, they were entangled with the 1904 World's Fair in St. Louis. The fair dominated the city, and the Olympics were reduced to something of a sideshow of lesser importance. The Games were stretched over several months, starting on July the 1st and ending on November the 23rd. Many international athletes were unwilling or unable to attend due to the costly and difficult journey to Missouri, meaning that only 13 nations were able to justify and send participants to take part. Due to this, there was a very minimal presence of competitors outside the United States of America, with 120 athletes taking part, while the host nation had a representation of over 520 athletes. As a result, the marathon featured a strange mix of competitors, a handful of seasoned runners who had glory in mind, some opportunists with no real training but still thought to give it a go, and even a few participants who had barely run before. The course itself was a disaster waiting to happen. It measured just over 24 miles, slightly shorter than the modern marathon distance, but the route was dusty and uneven, and it was riddled with steep hills. Temperatures soared past 30 degrees centigrade or 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and almost no thought had been given to the welfare of the runners. There were only 2 water stations on the entire course, one at the 6-mile mark and another at 12 miles, as this was partly due to a bizarrely planned experiment by the official James Edward Sullivan, who was the chief organizer of the Olympics, who wanted to study the effects of purposeful dehydration on athletes. And with the athletes and experiment ready to go, it set the stage for one of the strangest marathons in history. 32 runners lined up at the start line in the hot afternoon sun. Among them were Americans, a few Greeks, a French runner, a Cuban postman, and 2 men from South Africa who had never competed in an official race before, and it wasn't long before the chaos followed. As soon as the race begun, runners were swallowed by clouds of dust, which were kicked up by the officials' cars that were driving ahead. The athletes coughed violently as their throats and lungs began to burn with every breath they took along the course. Within just a few miles, the heat and the dust began to take its toll, as several runners collapsed from exhaustion, with one runner nearly dying after inhaling so much dust that he began to bleed from his lungs. The first bizarre twist came from Fred Lortz, an American bricklayer who had no serious marathon experience. After 9 miles, as he became exhausted and his muscles began cramping, he simply stopped running. But instead of withdrawing from the race, he hitched a ride in one of the official cars following the course. He rode for 10 miles, then as the car began to break down, and feeling somewhat recovered, he hopped out the car and rejoined the race on foot. Meanwhile, the Cuban runner and postman Anderin Carvajal quickly became a fan favourite. Carvajal had raised money for his Olympic journey by running across Cuba, but he lost most of his funds gambling in New Orleans on his way to St. Louis. Once he arrived at the race, he was in a shirt, wearing trousers which were cut off at the knees, and on his feet were a pair of worn-out shoes. Despite his appearance, he ran well, thanks to his fundraising running adventures back home in Cuba. but he soon grew desperately hungry after not eating for just short of 2 days. Along the route, he saw a spectator eating 2 peaches. Hungry as can be, he asked if he could eat the peaches, and the spectator declined. But this didn't stop the hungry postman from eating, as he stole them from the spectator and continued to run the marathon. Later along the route, he spotted an orchard, and Carvajal stopped to eat some apples. Unfortunately, they were mostly rotten, which made him feel even worse. He doubled over with stomach cramps, lying down and falling asleep by the side of the road, before slowly recovering and continuing on. The South African entrants, Len Torniani and Jan Masciani, had perhaps the oddest story of all. They weren't marathon runners at all, but rather performers brought to St. Louis as part of the World's Fair exhibition. They decided to join the race barefoot, running over gravel and sharp stones. Despite this, both placed remarkably well, with Masciani finishing in 12th place and Torniani finishing in 9th. While some accounts suggested that Torniani could have done even better if he had not been chased off the road by stray dogs during the race. But the true drama came at the front of the pack. Thomas Hicks, an experienced American runner, was determined to finish the race at any cost. By the 10-mile mark, Hicks was suffering badly from dehydration and begged his trainers for some water. Instead, they gave him something else, a mixture of egg whites and strychnine, a common form of rat poison. In small doses, strychnine was believed to stimulate the nervous system, and at the time, it was used as a kind of early-stage performance enhancer, and to help wash it down, Hicks was handed some brandy. Struggling, staggering, pale, and barely able to lift his legs, Hicks continued the marathon. After every few miles, his trainers dosed him with more strychnine and brandy, pushing him forward more and more like a puppet on strings, and by the final miles, he was heavily hallucinating. At the finishing stadium, the farcical race reached its peak. Fred Lortz, the runner who had hitched a car ride earlier, was the first to arrive. He trotted into the stadium, waving to the crowd, and was greeted as the apparent champion. After being hailed as the winner, he had his photograph taken with Alice Roosevelt, the daughter of then US President Theodore Roosevelt. She placed the wreath upon Lortz's head and was about to award him the gold medal when spectators and other officials claimed that Lortz had not run the entire race. He admitted that he had only intended the whole thing as a joke, though nobody found it funny. The Amateur Athletics Union decided he would be immediately banned for life, though the lifetime ban was short-lived, as it was later reduced just to 6 months, with him later going on to win the 1905 Boston Marathon. Moments later, the rat-poisoned, staggering figure of Thomas Hicks entered the stadium. He was propped up and supported by 2 of his handlers, with Hicks still moving his legs in a running motion, believing that he was still on the ground. Barely conscious, he collapsed as he crossed the finish line. Doctors rushed to treat him, and he came dangerously close to dying on the spot. His body was so ravaged by the ordeal that he lost nearly 4 kilograms in weight during the race. But against all odds, Hicks was declared the official winner, with a time of 3 hours, 28 minutes and 53 seconds, followed by Frenchman Albert Corry with a time of 3 hours, 34 minutes and 52 seconds, and Arthur Newton of the United States with a time of 3 hours, 47 minutes and 33 seconds, landing him in 3rd place. Sadly, the time of Cuban postman Andrén Carvajal is unknown, and he eventually returned home to Cuba, where he continued his running. But his Olympic story became a legendary anecdote, rather than a story of triumph. The race was a disaster for most of the competitors. Out of the 32 who started, only 14 managed to finish, with many being hospitalised with heat stroke, dehydration, or injured from the brutal course. The event was so bad that even the crowd were shocked. Newspapers at the time described it as a farce and as a dangerous experiment that had put athletes' lives at risk. The International Olympic Committee faced heavy criticism from the poor organisation, the lack of safety measures, and the bizarre conditions of the race. Even Thomas Hicks, the winner of the marathon, barely celebrated his victory. He later admitted that he remembered almost nothing of the final miles. The strychnine had left him in a state of near poisoning, and if he was to receive just one more dose, he could have easily died. The 1904 Olympic Marathon is remembered today less as a sporting achievement and more as a cautionary tale. It highlighted the dangers of poor planning and the lack of concern for athlete welfare in the early Olympics. The experiment with purposeful dehydration was widely condemned, with future games ensuring that more adequate water stations were to be included, meaning a stronger focus on safety measures for long-distance runners, while a greater importance and scrutiny over athletes' welfare was taken. Thomas Hicks's victory remains one of the most controversial in Olympic history, not because he cheated, but because he was essentially drugged to the finish line. His team's use of strychnine is often cited as one of the earliest cases of performance-enhancing drugs in sports. The race also left behind a strange and colourful cast of characters: the Cuban postman who ate rotten apples, the barefoot South Africans chased by dogs, and the American who tried to ride to victory in a car. More than a century later, the 1904 Olympic Marathon still remains as one of the most chaotic and absurd races ever held under the Olympic banner. It was a contest where human endurance collided head-on with the intense summer heat, dust so strong it made runners bleed internally, and recklessness in a range of forms. But the 1904 St. Louis Olympic Marathon will remain a spectacle, remembered not for its triumph, but for the sheer madness of its execution.